Chapter 1. In the village of Much Trembling, this is the story of a young girl named Much Afraid, who learned to trust the chief shepherd. It is the story of how she left her fearing relatives and went with the shepherd to the high places where perfect love gets rid of fear. Much Afraid lived in a peaceful little white cottage in the Valley of Humiliation. She had many friends who lived there, who lived in the same village as she did. Here's the picture. So those are all her relatives. Many of her neighbors in the village of Much Trembling worked for the chief shepherd. For several years, Much Afraid herself had been in his service. She loved her work and really wanted to make the shepherd happy, but in her heart, Much Afraid was worried. She worried about her crippled body. Her feet were so crooked that she limped and often fell down as she went about her work. She also worried about her mouth. It was so crooked that it was hard for her to speak clearly. Much Afraid felt that she was not very pretty. More than anything else, Much Afraid wanted to be beautiful and graceful and strong, like so many of the shepherd's other workers. In fact, she wanted to be like the chief shepherd himself, but she was afraid that it would never be possible. There was another, even greater trouble in her life. Much Afraid was a member of the family of Fearings and her relatives over the valley. She could never get away from them. Much Afraid was an orphan and had grown up in the home of her aunt, poor Miss Dismal Forebodings. Dismal Forebodings means always being afraid and worried about the terrible things that might happen. So Much Afraid had lived with her aunt and her cousins, gloomy and spiteful. There's a picture of the lady who adopted her. Craven fear. Craven means to be very afraid. He was a bully who always did mean things to Much Afraid. So the girl's name is Much Afraid, okay? The family of Fearings hated the chief shepherd and were very upset that Much Afraid was one of his servants. They kept trying to make her quit working for him. Then one awful day, her relatives came to the cottage where Much Afraid lived and announced that she was to marry Craven Fear. What a horrible idea! She should have ordered them all to leave her cottage, but poor Much Afraid listened to her fearing relatives. She just sat, cowering before them, repeating again and again that nothing would ever make her marry Craven Fear. When they finally left her alone, it was nearly evening. Suddenly, Much Afraid thought of something that made her feel happier. The chief shepherd would be bringing his flocks of sheep to the watering place beside the village. Much Afraid met him there every morning to learn his wishes for the day, and again in the evenings to give him her report of the day's work. Still shaking with fear, she came to the pool where the shepherd was waiting for her. She told him that her family of Fearings had said, "What can I do?" she cried. Can they really make me marry Craven? Can they? And there's the picture of her. Oh, it is bad enough to be Much Afraid. I couldn't stand to be Mrs. Craven Fear for the rest of my life. Don't be afraid, the shepherd said gently. You are in my service, and if you trust me, they will not be able to force you. He paused for a moment, then continued. Much Afraid. You should never have let your fearing relatives into your cottage. They are enemies of the king who you serve. I know, cried Much Afraid, but whenever I meet any of my relatives, I feel so weak. As long as I live in the valley, I will keep my meeting them. They are everywhere. Now I will be too afraid to leave my cottage. Much Afraid looked across the valley and the river to the beautiful mountains. She cried out with all her heart, "Oh, if only I could leave this valley and go to the high places. The Fearings and my other relatives could never reach me there." To her great surprise, the shepherd answered, "I have waited a long time to hear you say those words, Much Afraid. It would be best for you to leave the valley and go to the high places. You need to live in the kingdom of love. No fears of any kind are there because perfect love gets rid of fear." Much Afraid stared at him in amazement. "Go to the high places," she exclaimed, "and live there? Oh, only if I could. For months I have been thinking about it, day and night, but it's not possible. I could never get there. I'm too crippled." She looked down at her crooked feet and her eyes filled with tears. "The mountains are so steep and dangerous. I have been told that only deer can move on them safely." Dear reader, this is a note from the author. From now on, we will refer to deer as harts, and Hinds harts are a kind of male deer, and hinds are female. So it's letting us know that the hinds are female and the harts are male deer. It is quite true that the way up to the high place is both difficult and dangerous, said the shepherd. It has to be, so that nothing which is an enemy of love can get into the kingdom. Nothing crippled or deformed is allowed, and the people who live there do need hinds feet. I have them myself, he added with a smile, and I can go leaping on the mountains with the greatest of ease and pleasure. Much afraid, I can make your feet like Han's feet too, and set you upon the high places, and you could then serve me much better and be out of the reach of all of your enemies. Much Afraid just stared at him. Make my feet like Hinds' feet? She repeated. How is that possible? And what about my crooked, ugly mouth? It is true, said the shepherd, that you would have to be changed before you could live in the high places, but if you are willing to go with me, I promise to help you. Up on the mountains, as you get closer to the high places, the air is so clean that it will strengthen your whole body. There are healing streams where everything there is not beautiful is washed away. There is something else I must tell you. No member of the fearing family can enter the kingdom of love. You will have to be given a new name first. Are you willing, Much Afraid, to be changed completely and to be made like the new name you will receive? She nodded her head and said, Yes, I am. And that is the middle of the chapter. We will stop there.